represent the Queensland Police Force and we're advocating for a limit to the liability for a third party for psychiatric injury.
We strongly argue that whilst there is some degree of protection afforded to the police force, that scope of protection is broadened.
A change in legislation would better serve the police force and those affected by psychiatric injuries.
I'll be examining the current state of the law.
I'll be looking at the policy and social effects.
And I'll be proposing reforms.
Prior to the introduction of the Civil Liabilities Act Queensland 2003, the law of negligence was wholly reliant on the common law. The overarching public belief was that the tort of negligence was unaffordable and unsustainable as the principal source of compensation for those injured through the fault of another. A concern largely amalgamated into the review of the Law of Negligence final report, also known as the IP report, released in late 2002. The reform had a significant effect on the elements of duty, breach, causation and damages. Now, it should be explained that under the Police Service Administration Act 1990, a Queensland legislation, the individual officer is granted immunity. The statute is not the only legislation of its kind. Similarly, the Forestry Act 1959, another Queensland piece of legislation, provides that a state official is not civilly liable. However, and in distinction from the Police Service Administration Act, Section 96E3 of the Forestry Act removes liability altogether. In a claim for damages for harm and a claim for psychiatric harm, the Civil Liability Act leaves duty of care in the general sense solely to the common law for interpretation. Now, when considering the general duty of care, the court will consider whether the injury caused was reasonably foreseen, something which Tame in New South Wales failed to prove. Tame in New South Wales and Annette's and Australian stations calls for the court to consider if a person of normal fortitude might have suffered psychiatric injury, what the relationship was between the parties, and whether the person claiming had perceived the events with their own senses. Stewart and Kirkland Venstra defined that simple power to act is not sufficient to show a duty of care. And finally, the case of Sutherland Shire Council and Hayman established reliance as a key salient feature in the application of whether the public authority owed a duty of care. Compared to the Queensland Civil Liability Act, the Civil Liability Act 2002 New South Wales defines what is required to identify and understand a recognised psychiatric illness, something that the Queensland Act omits. Now, once a duty can be established, the question becomes, did the acts or omissions of the public authority breach their duty of care? Section 9 of the Civil Liability Act provides that the plaintiff must prove on the balance of probabilities that the actions of the public authority fall below the standard of care likely to be taken by the reasonable man. Now, this is to be determined by the court in accordance with Section 9(2). Importantly, the Act allows for the justification of those acting in social utilities, and in this case, that would allow for the police, for example, to drive at exceeded speed or drive through red lights in the case of a car chase. Section 9(c) is whether the risk was obvious. Now, in the early case of New South Wales and Fay, the court held that the state of New South Wales did not breach its duty of care, as such events might obviously call for the carrying out of the task which the plaintiff had claimed to cause post-traumatic stress disorder. Now, in an example from the move from common law to statute, so as to tighten or restrict the ability to claim for damages for harm, the need for the plaintiff to show the risk is not insignificant. That test has stemmed from the common law test of not far-fetched or fanciful. Importantly, Section 35D allows for the public authority to prove compliance with general procedures of standard of care by presenting its own evidence that those practices are the standard of care. Following recommendations from the IP report, the elements of causation were split into two parts. each of which need to be proven in order to be successful in a claim of causation. Section 11, subsection 1 of the Civil Liability Act provides that in order to be successful in proving a causal link between the defendant's actions and the plaintiff's damage, you must evaluate two limbs. Firstly, factual causation, followed by the scope of liability. Factual causation, the first limb, is largely applied in three sections. Section 11.1a, Section 11.2 and Section 11.3. This idea of factual causation closely replicates the common law but-for test, originally used in the evaluation of a causal link, however, showed large evidentiary gaps when applied in cases where there were multiple causes of the damage. Now, the scope of liability, the second limb, is applied through sections 11.1b and sections 11.4 and creates a chance to further clarify why the defendant should be responsible for the harm caused to the plaintiff. Now, the IP report explains that the scope of liability should explain whether and why the harm should be left where it were to lie. Nominal damages, a rare damage given more in the intentional tort rather than the negligence claims, won't be touched on. However, compensatory damages, including, and more specifically, special damages, which are damages that can be calculated and can include payments for medical fees and loss of income, for example, and general damages, which are the awards for damages that can't be calculated, things such as pain and suffering. In awarding these damages, the court's goal is to put the plaintiff back into the position that they would have been had the tort not been committed. It is this principle which creates a rather distinguishing inequity in the award for damages for those who, for example, are not high-income earners. To further this inequity, the once and for all rule further restricts the rights of those suffering from a prolonged psychological injury to face the court again. The Civil Liability Act holds provisions through Chapters 3 regarding damages. However, importantly, it fails to make reference to the effects of the claim for pure psychiatric harm. The state of Victoria and New South Wales both make references in their calculations for damages to the effect of a claim for pure psychiatric harm. And furthermore, where in the case of New South Wales and Fay, the court examined the provisions of the Police Service Act 1990, a New South Wales piece of legislation. The Queensland equivalent, the Police Service Administration Act 1990, omitted such awards in a 2014 amendment.
To afford the police the proper degree of protection necessary to meet the high demands being placed upon them. There are two identifiable stakeholders attached to liability of the police force for third-party psychiatric injury, these stakeholders being the general public and the police force. Bransley and Mozzarella's article, Policing in an Era of Uncertainty, recognises the new challenges facing the police force in the 21st century. These challenges include an increase of drug offences and the growing role played against the fight against terrorism. We spoke to Inspector Florey to gauge an understanding of the effect legislative change would have for the police force.
Okay, well, so perhaps I can give you an introduction.
Yes, just an overview.
I was sworn into the Queensland Police Force as it was then, in March 1979. My current role is I'm a regional duty officer for the Brisbane region. So the region is 2,500 square kilometres in southeast Queensland. Covers from Debra in the north to Springwood in the south.
Would you say that there's a very broad role just for police in general out on the street? You know, anything from issuing tickets or, you know, speeding to dealing with, you know, terrorist threats? Is it that broad?
We, the average general duty officer deals with everything that we have. Where particular incidents hone in on particular styles of policing needs, we call in people who specialise.
Yeah.
So as an example, on a fatal traffic crash, the average run-of-the-mill general duties officer will go to that, and then we would call in our forensic crash unit, who specialise in investigating fatal traffic crashes. Terrorism, we don't have a lot of terrorism acts. Most of our work in terrorism is proactive at the moment, although we do have some events that occur where terrorism potentially could be an element, and we do have a reactive force to counter anything that comes up.
Okay. Would you say that there are higher demands placed on the police force now since you've started off? Have you noticed, an increase in the level or the type of crime?
Yeah, crime has become more sophisticated. Crime is now globalised, which it wasn't when I first joined. So when I first joined, we would have criminals operating in a fairly restricted area. And whilst the level of violence would still be there in some instances, it was more simple crime, for want of a better way of putting it. Crime is a community issue, it's not just a police issue. And without community support, without information from the community, the police can't do anything.
Do you think people considering a career in the police force might be deterred for fear of litigation or liability? Is it something that they might be conscious of?
It's ever most in the minds of operational police.
Yes.
And so much so that sometimes, particularly junior police, will not act for fear of potential litigation at some point in time. But they are ever mindful of that potential, and we're becoming a more litigious society like the US.
Yes.
We're not to that point yet, but certainly a lot of junior police will, well, not only junior police in general, will think of that element when they're acting, and in not acting, in my view, they can potentially increase their liability for not acting. So it's certainly a two-edged sword. What I rely on, we have legislation to support us. So we have the Police Service Administration Act, which you are aware of. It has the functions of the service. It provides police with powers. As delegated legislation, we have police service policy issued by our Commissioner under Section 4.9 of that Act. That enables us to do certain things, the application of force, the use of processes. And it's my firm view that if police act within the law, if they act using the policy correctly and their use of force options correctly, and they balance their general duty of care under the oath of office, there is nothing to fear. That doesn't mean that someone can't lodge a claim against them, but if they've done everything properly and they've acted in good faith and they've acted with due diligence without being negligent, they have nothing to fear. That's probably a more mature look at it over 40 years of policing.
In more recent times, not just litigation for physical injuries, but psychiatric injury. Thames in New South Wales is a good case, an example. So, we're really just trying to limit that.
Yes. So with the psychiatric injury claims are difficult in all spheres, not only in police and public interaction, but in workplace interaction, in work cover matters. I'm a little bit of a student of places like QCAT and the precedents of our higher courts, and it's a very difficult issue on both sides when it comes to psychiatric or psychological injury, and people can and have been seen to be less than truthful when they make those claims.
Do you believe that you're afforded adequate protection? Is there room for improvement in your mind?
Look, I'll pick a topical issue for us at the moment, and that's the matter of police pursuits. It's a case of we're damned if we do and we're damned if we don't. So the most recent example, stolen car in Ipswich, and I won't bore you with the details, but a police officer using his powers under the Police Powers and Responsibilities Act has deployed stingers. That stolen car has veered away from the stingers and knocked him over, and he's in a critical condition. The question is, should police pursue? If they don't pursue, what's the ramifications? So, in my view, we have a very restrictive police pursuit policy in Queensland. Some people would say we have a no pursuit policy. That's not actually true. In the matters of criminals in cars driving dangerously, particularly stolen cars, I see that we have a duty under our oath of office, and we have powers provided to us by the state of Queensland to actually do something about that.
How stringent is recruit training, and what value is placed on it?
Recruit training is very much a foundation period in a police officer's life. So,
Once they enter the force for 5 years more, is there mandatory training or mandatory exercise they have to partake just to keep up their training?
they have yearly qualifications in firearms, use of force, and different tactics.
Yeah.
As far as keeping up with the changes in laws and policies, that's done virtually daily.
Yes.
So they'll be notified. We have online learning products. We used to do regular what they call block training, which was face-to-face training. So we've moved away from that now and we do online modules.
What positive effects might there be for the police force if stronger protection is granted?
Look, I think that would have a personal effect on a lot of police in that they would feel some comfort that they can actually reach out and actually use the powers that they have and use the processes and policies that have been provided. And as we talked about earlier, there is that element of fear amongst them, whether it be correct or incorrect, that they may lose their house or they may lose their job or they may cost someone hundreds of thousands of dollars. So I think it's a great concept. I think it's a great topic to be raised, and I think there's certainly room for improvement to give some police protection against non-negligent acts. But one issue I did want to talk to you about very briefly about that is in the Civil Liability Act. A lot of people forget the second arm of how that applies. It's certainly if they do something, they can be held to be negligent. But if they don't do something, they can also be held to be negligent.
Yes.
And a lot of people forget that second element.
Yes.
So, I think some legislative protection would go a long way towards police being more effective.
Wonderful. Inspector Floyd, thank you very much for your time.
As discussed, the current state of liability in Queensland is a hybrid system which applies common law and statute. In the past, members of the public suffering psychological injury have sued the Crown in order to gain compensation for their injuries. Whilst the protection of individuals of the police force is adequate, police officers are still ending up in the court system facing negligent suits in relation to powers carried out within the line of duty. Our aim is to give police members immunity from negligence suits against them in relation to psychological injury suffered by innocent bystanders witnessed during police duty. Whilst there is some degree of protection afforded to the police, there lies an opportunity to broaden the scope of protection. This can be achieved with the following 3 recommendations. Firstly, reform the law and amending the Police Services Administrations Act 1990 Queensland. We propose to omit section 10.5 subsection 4 and instead apply the following amendment. 10.5 Protection of state liability. The Crown will not be civilly liable for an act or omission made that results in the psychiatric injury of the third party in A, the performance or purported performance of a function under this Act, or B, the exercise or purported exercise of a power under the Act. Secondly, and importantly, the implementation of a no-fault scheme. This is due to the first recommendation and ensures a balance of interest between both parties. We propose a scheme which would allow for compensation without having to prove fault, modelling the Accident Compensation Corporation ACC in New Zealand. The system would involve community responsibility, full rehabilitation and compensation. Type 1, non-significant, resulting in debilitating major anxiety, depression, schizophrenia, post-traumatic stress disorder, and payment to a certain threshold. Type 2 is insignificant, resulting in mild anxiety, depression, and less severe forms of psychological harm, and payment to a certain threshold. Damages are capped in a no-fault system, however, the trade-off is you do get less money. Large sums of money can prove troublesome with people who are not able to manage their money effectively and resulting in premature loss of funds and in turn fundamental critical care. Outstanding costs of mental health care is distributed in our community through government organisations such as the NDIS and Medicare. We propose an officer distributes the agreed capped amount in small increments directly to the agreed healthcare provider. The National Disability Insurance Scheme, the NDIS, which is currently being rolled out across Australia and is due to be finished in 2020, provides support and assistance for people living with various disabilities. Psychosocial disability may result from someone who has mental issues, and the NDIS has a flexible system tailored to each individual to assist both social and emotional well-being. The NDIS works together with other mental health systems, ensuring the appropriate amount of care is received. While the NDIS do not cover the cost of mental health services, they can assist in making sure those in need receive the care required. The scheme complements our proposal and together with Medicare can provide rehabilitation services as needed in addition to mental health care treatment. It is assumed that people with a disability lead lives which are tragic. However, people with disabilities can and do lead fulfilling lives, and recently implemented systems such as the NDIS provides effective and much needed care that help people comfortably transition back into society. Thirdly, implementation of training. Furthermore, change can be achieved through a more holistic approach, where firstly there is increased mental health first aid training in the police force. Mental health first aid training is imperative. Police officers are first responders to serious enough and dangerous events, and whilst police are aware of the seriousness of dealing with mental health patients, the training they receive is vastly inadequate, receiving just 30 minutes of training. Such training was received by a young constable who in 2013 delivered 5 fatal shots to a psychiatric patient while protecting her partner. We propose that all police officers undergo mental health first aid training as part of their routine instruction. We advise this training to be updated regularly in accordance with the police force mental health intervention team before being deployed on active duty. Further training of young recruits is especially important. We propose new recruits have further training in addition to what is mandatory at present. It may be argued through implementation of a no-fault compensation scheme that the deterrence factor for police officers may be lost. However, as expressed by Inspector Florey, the training regulations for new recruits are stringent and ongoing throughout their career.
At this point in time, there's 6 months of training. It's a mixture of law, it's a mixture of police policy, it's a mixture of discipline. Not unlike the Australian Defence Forces, we get people in, we change their views if that's necessary, and a police officer isn't really capable of doing the job until they have about 5 years service.
Young and inexperienced constables need to be shown how to deal with traumatic circumstances and taught how to be empathetic towards those who may witness disturbing scenes. Young officers need to be made acutely aware that what for them might be a daily occurrence can have a serious effect on people in the general public. The ultimate aim is for police officers to carry out their duties effectively and efficiently and be secure in the knowledge that whilst they are doing so, they will not be held liable as they continue to uphold the law and protect our community. We are seeking to accomplish a balance between both stakeholders, ensuring the general public are adequately protected for any psychiatric injuries suffered during the execution of police duties. This ensures any injured party is appropriately compensated, that in turn bypassing the court system and protecting the individual officer. It is our goal to ensure these people have access to doctors, psychologists and psychiatrists as required. We propose avoidance of the court system for police officers acting within the scope of their duty. This would result in lower administration costs, less excess cases monopolising the court system, and no loss of time off work for police officers. Litigation removes our officers from the streets when it is in the public interest for them to be at work. As discussed in the policy and social effects, there are increasing demands being placed on our police force to be at work due to the escalation of the type and level of crime, growing rate of drug offenders, and the increasing threat of terrorism. For these reasons, their need to secure public safety has never been more important. Benefits of no litigation to the plaintiff include no trauma of a lengthy litigation process or loss of wages. Studies also suggest that people tend to recover faster when they do not go through the court system. In balancing the interests of the plaintiff as well as police officers, we suggest e-health sessions between the plaintiff and healthcare professionals, which would reduce the need and cost of mental health care and would enable mental health practitioners easier access to patients in crises. This process would eliminate the need for travel, longer waiting times, and lessen overhead costs. We also propose to introduce an e-health session where a member of the police force calls the plaintiff to check in and see how they're going. While it's not going to cost an exorbitant amount of money to implement the policy of checking in to the recipient, this simple act is worth so much more than money.
In this proposal, we've examined how police liability for a third-party psychiatric injury should be limited.
We have gauged an understanding as to the effect such changes would have for the police force.
And we have proposed reforms that would better serve the police force and those affected by psychiatric injuries.
Thank you.